That moment when you realize your skincare is actually working. That's Rodan & Fields, the #1 female dermatologist-founded skincare brand in the U.S. Designed by 2 dermatologists who don't just know women's skin, they know how to formulate for it. Rodan & Fields, love what you see. Tap the banner or visit rodanandfields.com/Spotify to get your exclusive welcome offer.
Choosing a bottled Starbucks Frappuccino drink that's all flavor and just 100 calories? Easy. Choosing between creamy vanilla, double chocolate, and sea salt caramel flavors? A little harder. Try the delicious new Starbucks Frappuccino light drinks. Look for them wherever you buy groceries. Start with Starbucks coffee.
Welcome back, True Crime Army. I am your host, Margot, and this is Military Murder, a show where I focus on crimes committed by military members and veterans. But don't worry, you don't have to know anything about the military to listen. You just have to be a true crime enthusiast, and if that's you, welcome home. This week, I am bringing you one of the cases that still baffles me to this day. It's the case that reminds me of a rumor mill. You hear it once and you tend to doubt the rumor. It just doesn't add up. But then you hear it again and again and again until one day it's no longer a rumor, it is stated as fact. And then when you learn that the entire rumor or alleged facts were fabricated, you can't forget what you heard in the first place, and you wonder if the original rumor is true, but now someone is yanking your leg. Did I confuse you yet? Well, put on your thinking caps, because at the end of this 2-part episode, you will be left wondering, what is wrong with the justice system? Just as a note to listeners, this episode does include discussions of rape, so please listen with care. With that, join me today as I tell you the tragic story of the murder of military spouse Michelle Moore-Bosko. Now, let's dig in.
Military murder is an independent project and is not endorsed by the Department of Defense or any military component. The views expressed are those of the host. The content of this podcast is not meant to be legal or medical advice. Warning, this episode contains graphic details of murder and is not suitable for young listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
Most of you know that I'm an Air Force girl, and if you didn't, surprise, I am. Don't hate me, I love all the services the same. But the one service that I understand the least is the Navy. With their missions and duty and different rank structure, I just don't understand it, but I admire it. Well, today, I'm taking you all to the Navy, Norfolk, Virginia, circa the late 1990s. Picture this. A guided missile frigate, the USS Simpson, arrived back to port at Norfolk Naval Base on July 8, 1997. Sailor Billy Bosko just returned from the USS Simpson after a 1-week training mission. As Billy walked down the gangplank to Pier 5 with all the other sailors, he looked for his wife, Michelle, among the faces of the families gathered to welcome their sailors home. But Michelle wasn't there to greet him. This was not the way Billy had imagined his homecoming. He thought that Michelle, his newlywed wife, would spot him across the crowd and start running towards him. You know, like you see on the movies when troops come home. Then he'd sweep her up in his arms and just squeeze her until she yelped for joy. But this was not like the movies. Billy and Michelle had eloped in April and were trying to save money to have a wedding with their families back in Pittsburgh in October. To help fund the wedding, Michelle had recently applied for a job at McDonald's, and Billy wondered if maybe she had started the job already and was at work. This was 1997. Cell phones were around, but not prevalent, so Billy really had no way of knowing what had happened over the previous week while he was at sea. Since Michelle wasn't there to drive him to the airport, Billy grabbed his bags and hopped in a taxi to arrive home. When he opened the front door to their apartment, he noticed that the place was spiffy. It looked super clean. He figured Michelle must have cleaned their little apartment to welcome him home. But just like at the pier, Michelle wasn't there to greet him. At first glance, the apartment seemed normal to Billy, but then he started noticing things that were off. The kitchen light was on, for example, but he and Michelle were really good about turning the lights off. It was one of the things that they did to save money for the wedding. Billy dropped his bags off next to the couch by the front door, and as he looked around, he noticed that the blinds were closed over the front window. It was daytime, and they usually had those open. On the table, Billy saw a note that Michelle had left him, and that note really made him smile. The note from Michelle and her friend Tamika was a request to have Billy be their coach as they tried out a new diet. Billy figured he'd go take a shower while he waited for Michelle to come back home. But just as he stepped towards the bathroom, he saw her. Originally, Billy expected to be a part of a rom-com, but he quickly learned he was now living in a horror movie. Michelle was lying on the floor of the bedroom with her arms raised above her head. Her hair had been held up in a clip but was out, and her hair was all messy around her head instead. Billy backed out of the room and frantically looked for their cordless phone. When he couldn't find it, he ran across the hallway and pounded on a different apartment door. His neighbor across the hall, fellow sailor Daniel Williams, answered his door and used his phone to call the police. Daniel lived there with his wife Nicole and their roommate, another sailor named Joe Dick. After the police had been called, Billy and Daniel went back across the hall into Michelle and Billy's apartment. Billy told Daniel not to go into the bedroom with him, but curiosity got the best of him, so Daniel walked into the bedroom. Michelle was nude from the waist down and was only wearing a black t-shirt. Her legs were spread open with her knees bent, so the two men took a blanket and covered the lower half of Michelle's body. Billy was so frantic by what he was witnessing that he punched a hole in the hallway wall, breaking his hand in the process. Then he ran for the exit and threw up in some bushes outside. By this time, police had arrived and had called for homicide to respond. The police weren't expecting to come into a brutal murder scene. When the call had come over the radio, the report was that an 18-year-old had died of natural causes, specifically that a teenager had been found by her husband in their apartment. The responding detectives kind of knew better. Not many 18-year-old people just die of natural causes out of the blue. When detectives Maureen Evans and Scott Halverson arrived, the patrol officer who had gotten there first had Billy sitting in the squad car. Detective Evans went over to him, but due to the shock, Billy couldn't even talk. Detective Evans tried to get Billy to talk and calm down by asking him to tell her all about the good memories with his wife, Michelle. Billy recounted how he thought Michelle would be at the pier when the ship pulled in and how he thought she might have started her new job. Then he told the detectives what happened when he got home and what he saw. Detective Evans entered the apartment and surveyed the scene. She could tell that Michelle had blood in her lungs when she died based on the blood spatter. Michelle had coughed or spit up blood, causing it to spray across her body and the floor around her. The detective was pretty sure, based on the way that Michelle's body was positioned and the lack of clothes on her lower body, that she had been sexually assaulted. Detective Evans knew Michelle had suffered as she lay there dying, later saying that it took her breath away just thinking about the crime scene. Michelle had been stabbed repeatedly in the chest, and it looked as if she had been beaten. She had bruising around her jaw and neck, indicating she had been strangled as well. As the detectives took in all the evidence, they noted that there were no signs of forced entry. This led them to believe that Michelle must have let her assailant in willingly, and this told detectives the killer was most likely someone Michelle was familiar with and trusted enough to open the door for that person. Initial suspicions, of course, went to Billy because, as we all know in the true crime community, #thehusbanddidit. But Detective Evans didn't think he could be capable of harming his wife. She felt that Billy wasn't a murderer. He looked like he was deeply in love with Michelle. Michelle's best friend, Tamika Taylor, a mom of twins, lived in the same apartment complex as the Boskos. They met at the pool after Billy and Michelle had moved in and hit it off. Tamika and Michelle would often look for jobs together, and sometimes Tamika would stay over at the Boskos' apartment. Tamika was brought out to talk to the investigators. She was the last person known to have talked to Michelle the night before, and that was at around 11 p.m. Detective Evans pressed Tamika for any information about who may have done this to Michelle, asking her, "Who did this? I don't care if it's your best friend. Point me in the direction of who did this. She let them in her house," end quote. Tamika told detectives that she thought that when Billy was away, the neighbor across the hall, Daniel Williams, paid way too much attention to Michelle. Tamika thought that Daniel was obsessed with Michelle and that he gave off a total creeper vibe. Daniel, you might recall, was the neighbor who helped Billy by calling the police when he had discovered Michelle's body. Daniel was also the one who ignored Billy's warning not to go into the bedroom. Tamika told Detective Evans that Daniel would somehow always be there whenever Michelle left the apartment or returned home. Somehow, Daniel was always around to call out, "Hi, Michelle. Bye, Michelle." According to Tamika, while Billy was away, she went to Michelle's to drink some wine coolers with some other friends, when all of a sudden, Daniel showed up and asked to use the phone. Michelle let him in, but when he was done using the phone, he asked if he could stay and hang out at the party. Then he proceeded to start dancing to the music, But not just dance, Daniel gyrated around, pumping his hips around the floors and walls. And what upped the creep factor that day was the fact that Daniel had locked eyes with Michelle the entire time he was gyrating. When Tamika had seen enough that night, she's like, "Daniel, you have got to go." He complied, and then Tamika turned to her good friend Michelle and said, "Listen here, girl. Don't let that guy back into your apartment, not to use the phone, not for anything. He cannot be trusted." After interviewing Tamika, Detective Evans really wanted to talk to Daniel. So she decided to use the 911 call to report Michelle's death as the reason to get Daniel to the police station. The detective called Daniel and asked him to come down to the station. Daniel was supposed to go to dinner with his wife and mom, but told them that he'd catch up with them at the restaurant. Daniel and his wife Nicole were also newlyweds, but sadly, Nicole had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer, so she and Daniel ended up getting married sooner than planned to ensure she had proper health care. Daniel arrived at the police station at around 6:15 p.m., but wasn't interviewed until about 8 p.m. So much for those dinner plans, I guess. Once the interview started, Detective Evans read Daniel his rights and began the questioning. Starting out, Daniel talked about marrying his wife and her cancer diagnosis. When they finally started talking about Michelle, Daniel told them that he had just started talking to her a week before and hadn't seen her since Saturday, July 5th. He said that he had never talked to her while it was just the two of them. Now, Michelle's friends were always there. That was his version of events. Detective Evans and Detective Halverson thought that Daniel was lying. They told Daniel that Michelle's friend said that he had talked to Michelle alone. At that point, Daniel admitted that maybe once or twice he had talked to her without anyone else there, and the detectives had a specific example that Michelle's friends told them about. Daniel was in Michelle's apartment one night at 2 a.m. Daniel said that he was there because he and Michelle would talk about Nicole's diagnosis. Detectives asked if Daniel ever had an affair with Michelle, and he denied it, saying he hadn't even thought about that. Then detectives asked if he would be willing to take a polygraph to prove it. Daniel said, "Yes, of course, I'm not lying." Before they would begin the polygraph, they asked Daniel one last question. Did he touch anything when he entered the house with Billy after Michelle was discovered? Daniel said yes, he touched the blanket that he used to help Billy cover Michelle's body. The detectives immediately found a discrepancy in this response, since hours earlier back at the crime scene when initially interviewed, Billy said he hadn't touched a thing. Daniel was taken to have the polygraph, while the two detectives interviewed Billy, Michelle's husband. When the polygraph and the interview were over, Billy and Daniel passed each other in the police station hallway. Daniel told Billy, "Hey man, I'm really sorry about this. If you ever need anyone to talk to, I'm here." They took Daniel back to an interview room where they had his DNA taken. They also took samples of his hair from his head and his underwear. At this point, the detectives informed Daniel that he had failed the polygraph. But in actuality, he had passed. But Daniel didn't know that, and the detectives were not legally required to tell him the truth. So just after midnight, after almost 4 hours of questioning, the interview resumed. As the night progressed, Daniel's story changed as the detectives fed him little bits of information about the crime and the crime scene. Earlier, he had denied wanting to have an affair with Michelle, and the detectives told him that telling the truth now would look better than in 6 months when the DNA results came back and were a match to him. So Daniel thought about it, and now he admitted that he did want to have sex with Michelle and that he was infatuated with her. As Detective Halverson pressed for more, Daniel first denied having sex with Michelle or even being with her the night she died. Then Daniel started questioning what happened, but he was questioning his memory out loud, saying things like, "Maybe I had been sleepwalking." He just couldn't remember. The questioning went on until nearly 3:30 a.m., when Daniel took a break to have a soda and smoke some cigarettes. When they returned, Daniel stayed on course, saying that he was obsessed with Michelle but didn't have any physical contact with her. Just after 4 a.m., remember, Daniel went to the station at 6:15 p.m., so 10 hours earlier, the two detectives, Evans and Halverson, called another detective in to assist with questioning. The detective, Glenn Ford, was known for being able to get suspects to confess to their crimes. And it took less than an hour for Daniel to tell Detective Ford that he was ready to tell the truth. At 5:40 a.m., they went to get Daniel a cup of coffee, and when they returned, Daniel confessed. The following is what Daniel said. Quote, "I knocked on her door. Michelle was hesitant to open it, but I convinced her to. I forced it open the rest of the way. My wife was asleep next door. I didn't mean for anything to happen, maybe a little struggle. I tried to pin her down. I was wearing a pair of white briefs, no shoes. She was wearing a black t-shirt and a white pair of underwear. When I left, she was hollering and screaming. I never choked her. I don't remember whether I hit her. I never ended up having sex with her, end quote. Ford asked why he had attacked Michelle, and Daniel responded, quote, everything was building up. I hadn't had sex in a couple of months. Michelle was a pretty girl, end quote. At 6 a.m., 12 hours after being at the police station, Detective Halverson escorted Daniel to the bathroom. When they returned, Daniel continued his confession, quote, I pushed her into the bedroom. She said, get out, get out. I threw her to the floor. I held her arms above her head and raped her, but never ejaculated. She kept saying no. I punched her in the side of the head. I took a shoe and hit her again. I fondled her and removed her underwear. I didn't think about it again until Bill came home. Then I got real scared, end quote. There it was. After 14 hours, the detectives had what they were looking for. They had a confession. After the confession, Daniel Williams was charged with the rape and murder of Michelle Moore-Bosko. Due to the gravity of the offense, a judge ordered Daniel be held without bail. Sometime later that day, on July 9th, 1997, Daniel added something to his confession. He said that he had stabbed Michelle. Today's episode is sponsored by Acorns, and April is Financial Literacy Month, an entire month dedicated to taking control of your money. Because honestly, no one really taught me how to manage money growing up. I didn't learn about investing until I was well into adulthood. But what I love about Acorns is that it makes it easy to start saving and investing for your future in just 5 minutes. I know, April is an entire month, but you don't need an entire month to learn. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns recommends a diversified portfolio that matches you and your goals. You can start with just your spare change. And you don't need a lot of time. Setup takes just 5 minutes because I know that your time is precious. And if financial wellness has ever felt out of reach, Acorns makes it simple, giving your money a chance to grow without the overwhelm. Personally, using Acorns gave me the confidence to stop putting it off and just start. And that peace of mind is completely worth it. Sign up now and join over 14 million all-time customers who've already saved and invested over $25 billion with a B dollars with Acorns. Head to acorns.com/militarymama or download the Acorns app to get started today. Paid non-client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors, LLC, an SEC registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/militarymama.
This episode is brought to you by Netflix. 3 couples, 4 vacations, a lot to unpack. Watch The 4 Seasons, a new series starring comedy favorites Tina Fey, Steve Carell, Will Forte, Coleman Domingo, and more in a hilarious and heartfelt love letter to long-term relationships. Based on the original Alan Alda film. Watch The 4 Seasons, streaming now only on Netflix.
Michelle Moore-Bosko was laid to rest in a pink coffin on July 12th in her hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Her casket was open for a viewing, allowing everyone to see how swollen her face was. It was evident that she had met a violent end to her life. Hundreds of people attended Michelle's burial mass. Billy was dressed in his white Navy uniform, seated in the very front row. When they departed the church to go to the cemetery, there were more than 100 cars in the procession. Michelle was buried at Calvary Cemetery, where mourners covered her coffin with pink roses before it was lowered into the ground. The headstone reads, Our loving daughter Michelle Lynn, August 19, 1978 through July 8, 1997. Not surprisingly, Billy did not take Michelle's death well. He searched for peace while simultaneously searching for a reason to go on without her. In just 4 weeks, he dropped a whopping 25 pounds. He was only 5'7" tall, so it was a drastic weight loss on his small frame. His mom, Pat, worried that her son wouldn't recover from his grief. He stayed holed up in the house on some days. On others, he would go out into the woods and his mom wouldn't have any idea where he was. A month after Michelle's death, Billy returned to Norfolk. He moved out of the apartment and into an apartment with a Navy buddy, Chuck Little, and his wife, Erin, who was Michelle's best friend from Pittsburgh. It turned out that Billy had introduced the couple to each other. Because he was so traumatized, Billy slept on a mattress inside the walk-in closet in the couple's bedroom. This is a very interesting fact that we rarely hear, but it's the trauma of survivors who lose their loved ones or the ones that find the tragic scene. Well, while Billy was grieving his wife, back at the base, another sailor threatened Billy. The bully was friends with Daniel Williams, and he was upset that Dan had been charged with the murder. Well, the threat was enough to spook Billy further, to the point where Billy purchased a gun and kept it beside his mattress in the walk-in closet. More than anything, Billy wanted to stay in the Navy. His dream was to become a military working dog handler with the military police, a position that would allow him to stay on shore duty forever. Billy's greatest fear was being out to sea and something happening to someone he loved at home again. But the Navy had other plans. They wanted to transfer him to the aircraft carrier Stennis, and it was getting ready for a deployment where it was scheduled to cruise around the world. Billy felt like he was being punished, but ultimately, he did receive an honorable discharge under a reduction in force program. After leaving the military, Billy moved back to Pittsburgh in September of 1997, where things didn't get any better for him. He was haunted by memories and grief. In November, he had a full-down breakdown in a grocery store parking lot. He hurled a shopping cart, threw up, and collapsed, crying uncontrollably. Billy had given up on prayer after Michelle was killed, but in that moment, he turned back to it after his breakdown. He prayed, quote, "God, I tried, and this is what happened. I know I'm here for a reason. Wherever I'm supposed to go and whatever I'm supposed to do, you're going to have to put me there, because basically I'm hanging on until I do what I have to do. And then I'd like to go see Michelle," end quote, which is so sad. So let's talk a little bit about how Michelle and Billy met. Billy and Michelle met on the school bus in 1994. He called her Toots, and she firmly told him her name was Michelle, not Toots. They were friends for a while, although Billy asked her out on a date every single day until he finally gave up one day. When he asked a different girl out, Michelle taunted him, saying, "So this is how you are? You just give up that easily? No, you keep trying. That's how it works." So Billy, probably confused, asked her one more time. This time, Michelle said yes. When they shared their first kiss, Michelle was so discombobulated after that she turned and walked straight into a wall, which is just about the cutest yet nerdiest thing I've ever heard. The couple dated, but with a few breakups sprinkled in here and there, until Billy shipped out for Navy boot camp. After graduation, he requested Norfolk as his duty station since it was the closest to Pittsburgh where Michelle would be. Michelle worked as a hairdresser after high school, and she and her best friend Erin made the 8-hour drive to Norfolk every 6 weeks so she could see Billy. During a trip down to see him in December of 1996, Billy told Erin his secret plan to propose to Michelle while singing a karaoke song. The song he chose was "I Cross My Heart" by George Strait. Billy pulled a chair into the center of the room and had Michelle sit in it. Then he started singing. The lyrics starting out, "Our love is unconditional, we knew it from the start. I see it in your eyes, you can feel it from my heart," end quote. In the middle of the song, as Michelle cried, Billy popped the question. She managed to nod her head yes, but Billy teased her, saying, "I can't hear you." A waitress across the room said if Michelle didn't say yes, that she would. Finally, Michelle screamed, "Yes, yes." They planned to have a Halloween wedding back in Pittsburgh, but the couple couldn't wait. They went down to the courthouse and got married in April. Billy and Michelle were so young and so broke, they didn't even have rings to exchange. Michelle went back to Pittsburgh until May. Then she moved back to Norfolk. They found a small apartment for $470 a month that was within walking distance from Norfolk's Gate 4. It was at this apartment where Michelle met her friend Tamika. Through Tamika, she and Billy met a 20-year-old civilian named Omar Ballard. One day, a group of people at the apartment complex accused Omar of hitting a woman who lived there. Michelle and Billy brought Omar into their apartment to stay safe from the mob until the police arrived. This happened on June 27, 1997, 10 days before Michelle would be ultimately murdered inside her home. On July 1st, Billy had to go aboard the ship for the week-long training cruise. Michelle drove him to the pier and sent him off with his favorite dinner packed in Tupperware and a Pepsi to settle his nervous stomach. Billy told her that he wasn't going to watch her drive away because, allegedly, it was bad luck. He said, "It's okay, Toots. I'll be home in about a week." Flashing forward back to the murder investigation in 1997, Nicole Williams, Daniel's wife, the man who stood accused of Michelle's murder, passed away from cancer on November 2nd. Daniel wasn't allowed to attend her funeral since he was held without bail for Michelle's murder. The DNA test came back in December. There had been a semen stain on a blanket next to Michelle's body that was tested and compared to Daniel's DNA. And it turned out it wasn't a match. It wasn't Daniel's DNA. As detectives pondered how it could possibly not be Daniel's DNA, they decided to go back and relook at other people who had been present at the scene during the initial investigation. And it turns out that Daniel's roommate, Joe Dick, was 21 and a machinist-mate fireman originally from Baltimore. He had been questioned at the time of the murder investigation in July, but he had given an alibi that he was on board the USS Sapin standing watch the night Michelle was killed. Standing watch basically means you're at work on the ship you're assigned to. While there, sailors do things like run drills and guard the entry and exit points. They eat and sleep on board and can't leave for 24 hours. I'm sure there's more to this, but that's the basics I gathered through this research. Detective Evans knew, or at least felt, that Joe was somehow involved with Michelle's death, and she felt that Joe's alibi was a crock of poop. So, without verifying with Joe's supervisor, in January of 1998, she brought Joe in for further questioning. But she wouldn't be doing the questioning. The job was left to Mr. Detective, quote, I always get a confession, Glenn Ford, and his partner, Brian Ray. Together, they picked Joe up from the ship. Joe took a polygraph and passed, but the detectives told him he didn't pass and they knew he was lying. That's when the two detectives, Ford and Ray, started in on a good cop, bad cop routine. Much like Daniel's interrogation, Joe was put in a room for hours on end while the detectives took turns questioning him. By the time they were done, 8 hours later, Joe had confessed to killing Michelle. During his confession, Joe stated that he and Daniel knocked on Michelle's door. When she opened it, they attacked her in the living room, hitting her in the face. According to Joe, Michelle threatened them with a knife, and Joe accidentally stabbed her 3 times. Detective Ford asked Joe why he stabbed Michelle, and Joe answered that he didn't know. Now, it bears mentioning that Joe said he used a kitchen knife but couldn't describe it. He also didn't know where he stabbed Michelle. Just like with Daniel, the detectives started feeding him bits and pieces of information about Michelle's murder. And just like in Daniel's case, Joe's story started to change to match the crime scene. After seeing the crime scene photos, Joe said that he and Daniel took turns raping Michelle in the living room. Joe said he used a towel to wipe himself off, which would have left DNA behind, but we'll come back to that later. Going on, Joe said that he accidentally stabbed Michelle 2 more times. Then Daniel stabbed her twice. He then said that they threw a towel over her legs before they left the apartment. Detectives didn't say anything, but there's no way that this was true. When Billy first got home, Michelle was nude from the waist down, and he, along with Daniel, had covered her up. Regardless, Joe had confessed to being a participant in Michelle's killing, so they proceeded with charging him with capital murder and rape. Joe's DNA was collected to test against the DNA that had been left at the crime scene. Joe Dick was also held without bond after he was charged. The results from his DNA analysis returned on March 26, 1998, and Joe's DNA was not a match. Now, if you're keeping score, that's 2 suspects, 2 confessions, and 0 evidence linking them to the crime scene. But hey, it's possible they were still involved. But who are they protecting? Joe was held in the Norfolk jail after his arrest. Detective Ford had an informant in the same jail that he used to convince Joe that there was yet another accomplice. Joe wrote letters that were intercepted by investigators, and in these letters, Joe referred to someone named Eric that he was apparently trying to protect. On April 8, 1998, Eric Wilson, a 21-year-old sailor originally from Texas, was arrested in connection to Michelle's murder. Just like the first 2 suspects, Eric denied having anything to do with Michelle's murder. He told investigators that he didn't even know the victim. He served on the USS Shreveport, not even in the same unit as Daniel or Joe, or even Billy for that matter. Just like the 2 before him, Eric was subjected to hours of interrogation. He started at about 10:10 a.m., and within 6 hours, the detectives had what they were looking for. The first story Eric told them was that he went to Michelle's with Daniel and Joe. He said that they started tickling Michelle on the floor of the living room where Daniel raped her. Eric was so upset at this that he left, But these detectives weren't done working on him. They kept pressing him and feeding him bits of information. Eventually, a different version of events came about. Now, Eric said that after they moved Michelle from the living room to the bedroom, that's where they took turns raping her. Eric told investigators that he left before Michelle was stabbed, though, because he was very upset about what was happening. With just his confession, Eric was also charged with capital murder and rape. They pulled his DNA and kept him in jail without bail like the others. In June, Eric's DNA results were in. He wasn't a match, but detectives were determined to find someone who was a match. They brought Eric back in for another round of interrogations on June 16th. Eric's confession changed a bit more during this questioning, and now Eric started adding more suspects. This time, he told investigators that he went to Michelle's apartment with Daniel, Joe, and another sailor named George Clark, and two other white men that he initially said he didn't know. When they got to the apartment, they covered the peephole so Michelle couldn't see. When they got inside, they forced Michelle to perform oral sex on them. Then he said that Joe retrieved a knife and then Daniel stabbed her. Then he said George stabbed her, and finally Joe took his turn and stabbed her as well. They were going to carry her body outside, putting her body on a blanket to carry her to Daniel's truck. When they heard a car, they got spooked and took her to the bedroom instead. Wow, this story was getting more and more complex by the minute. After this June 16th confession, Joe gave a description of this fellow named George Clark, who he said was assigned to the USS George Washington. Investigators also checked the sign-in logs from the jail and saw that Joe had a visitor. The log contained a woman's name, and when the detectives called her, they found out that she was a Navy spouse. They asked her if she knew some guy named George Clark, and she was like, "No, I don't." But she did recall that she did know one of Daniel's friends on the USS George Washington. This guy's name was Derek Tice. Oh Lord, please don't tell me that this Derek fellow somehow gets implicated now as well. Well, investigators then got a cruise yearbook from the USS Washington and they showed it to Joe. Specifically, they told him, look specifically at pages 488 through 495. They wanted to know if Joe recognized any of the sailors. While Joe browsed the pictures of all the sailors, he picked out a picture of Derek Tice and said, listen, that's George Clark. Let me guess. The investigators probably circled the picture in red and wrote, P.S. This is the guy. Come on now, guys. With this choice, cops had another suspect to talk to.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Derek Tice was a Navy brat when he was young, but moved to North Carolina when he was 15. He joined the Army out of high school, but switched over to the Navy after his enlistment was up. He wasn't stationed in Norfolk anymore. In June of 1998, he was living in Orlando, Florida. Norfolk police obtained a warrant and coordinated with the Orlando PD to take Derek into custody. Detective Ford, Mr. Confessions, drove to Florida and picked up Derek to bring him back to Virginia. Initially, Derek told investigators that he had nothing to do with Michelle's murder. But Detective Ford, being the kind that always got a confession, pressured Derek like he did the others, telling him that he would get the needle and die if he didn't confess. And get this, Derek asked for an attorney multiple times, but was denied. After 20 hours of interrogation, Derek finally confessed. He said that he went to Daniel Williams' apartment and met up with Eric Wilson, Joe Dick, and a fifth man, Geoff Ferris. According to Derek's confession, Daniel wanted to have sex with Michelle, so he and Geoff used a hammer to force the door open. When they got inside, Geoff grabbed the knife and he, Daniel, Joe, Derek, and Eric held Michelle up, then stabbed her, causing her to fall to the ground. Of course, these details didn't line up with the crime scene at all. So, detectives coached Derek and allowed him to make another statement. They were probably like, okay, try again. This time, Derek changed his story, naming another man, Richard Pauly. In this version, he said they all went to Michelle's apartment, covered the peephole, knocked, and said, "It's Dan." Michelle refused to open the door, so they pried it open from the outside. Once inside, they tore off her clothes and took turns raping Michelle. Daniel went first and Geoff went last. Then Derek came in the room and said, quote, "Just stab the bitch," end quote. Continuing, Derek said that Geoff grabbed a knife and stabbed her first. Then they all took turns stabbing her, with their newest perpetrator, Richard Pauly, stabbing her last. Derek said that they held her upright as she was being stabbed and then let her fall to the floor. After she fell, they had to move her off of Geoff's foot. He would go on to tell two more versions of the story with different details each time. After his fourth confession, Derek Tice was also charged with rape and murder. And the web of how all these men knew each other got crazier and crazier. It turned out that Richard Pauly was a 26-year-old former Army soldier. And get this, he was also Nicole's ex-husband. You know Nicole. Nicole is the neighbor across the hall, Daniel's wife. I'm losing count now, but I'm pretty sure we have 3 confessions now. Following Derek's confession, Richard was arrested on June 30th, 1998. But unlike the others, he refused to confess to the crime. Richard had an alibi. He was at his parents' house talking online with his fiancée who lived in Australia. Despite his refusal to confess and his strong alibi and zero evidence tying him to the crime scene, Richard Pauly was also charged with rape and murder. 23-year-old Geoff Ferris was arrested on July 9th, 1998, a year and a day after Michelle's body was discovered. Just like Richard, he was a former soldier, and like Richard, he refused to confess and asked for a lawyer. Detective Brian Ray wrote in his report that Ferris told them, quote, "If I did it, I must have buried it so deep I don't remember," end quote. Despite an alibi and requesting a lawyer, Geoff was charged with rape and murder. On August 25th, 1998, a preliminary hearing got underway. Joe Dick testified under oath, yet a different version of his confession. This time, there were 7 people total that entered Michelle's apartment. Himself, which is Joe Dick, Daniel Williams, Derek Tice, Eric Wilson, Richard Pauly, Geoff Ferris, and a 7th unnamed person. According to Joe, the 7th person went over because that person wanted to see the color of Michelle's underwear. They had talked about it and about not stopping there. They wanted to do more stuff to her. When they got into Michelle's apartment, she told them to go away, and they did. The group of men met back in the parking lot and returned to Michelle's apartment. This time, they covered the peephole and then forced their way in. They grabbed Michelle and carried her into her bedroom, where they all took turns raping her. Then, all of them, except for Eric Wilson, stabbed her. They covered her with a blanket and then left. Despite Geoff Ferris and Richard Pauly's rock-solid alibi and a lack of evidence, the judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to take them all to trial, and it was all based on the expected testimony of Joe Dick and Derek Tice. On August 28th, it was confirmed that none of the men who had been charged with Michelle's rape and murder matched the DNA left at the crime scene. But that didn't change a thing. The trials of all of the men would go on. In late October, Derek Tice was interrogated again. Police wanted to know about this 7th man. He gave a second confession implicating himself, Daniel, Joe, Eric, Richard, Geoff, and a seventh man that he said was nicknamed Scrappy. Derek went into detail about the crime, this time stating that he held one of Michelle's legs while Eric held the other. Joe had an arm and Geoff had the other arm. Richard Pauly was keeping her from squirming around because Michelle was struggling. They carried her to the bedroom, held her down on the floor, and then took turns raping her. Daniel first and Joe last. During the attack, Derek said that Eric hit her a few times. Then he gave Scrappy's real name, some fellow named John Dancer that he had been trying to protect. Now, Derek was saying that they were all at Daniel's apartment to have a party for another guy named CJ who was in town. They all went across the hall to Michelle's, but this time he said she let them in. That's when they all grabbed her, took her into the bedroom, and we kind of know how the story goes, right? This time he said that John Dancer, the newest suspect, was the one who grabbed the knife, but Daniel was the first to stab her. Then, allegedly, they all took turns with the knife. The last part of this version was that John covered her with a blanket before they left. Detectives searched for some guy named John Dancer, and they found him. He was a 25-year-old Navy veteran. He had moved to Philadelphia, where he worked as an air conditioning technician. Well, on November 4th, 1998, police showed up at his doorstep and arrested him. During John's interrogation, he provided an alibi and refused to confess. He had been at work on July 7th, 1997, and had gone out clubbing that night. His work records and ATM receipts verified this information. Detectives, however, still subjected John to a polygraph, which he passed with flying colors. However, just like the others, he was told, "You failed, buddy." John immediately asked for a lawyer. None of it mattered, though. John Dancer was charged with rape and murder. The following day, Derek Tice recanted his story, saying that John Dancer wasn't there at all. It was someone else, a black guy who was already at Daniel's apartment when Derek got there. Then Derek changed his story again, saying he didn't know anyone who was involved because he wasn't there himself. Now, y'all, if your head is spinning and spinning and spinning, same, because there are so many different versions of what happened to poor Michelle, yet none of it really matches the crime scene. During a preliminary hearing on November 27, 1998, Derek Tice said that he had gotten all of the information and facts about the crime scene from his very own attorneys. A month later, a preliminary hearing was held for John Dancer. At this hearing, Derek Tice took the stand, and even though he had recanted his story, he said that Daniel Williams, Joe Dick, Eric Wilson, Richard Pauly, Geoff Ferris himself, and John Dancer committed the crimes. So Derek Tice re-incriminated himself. Here's the newest version from Derek, which honestly, why his attorneys kept allowing this guy to talk is beyond me. Here goes. Derek said that they pushed Michelle's door open. They didn't force the door open with a hammer, as he had one time confessed. They took turns raping Michelle, Daniel first, Eric last. Joe and Geoff tried to make Michelle perform oral sex on them, but she bit Geoff's penis. Derek said that he ejaculated while raping Michelle. Then Daniel strangled her. John grabbed the knife and they all stabbed her. Daniel went first and Geoff went last. Then they covered her with a blanket from the chest down. In January of 1999, in an attempt to avoid the death penalty, Daniel Williams pled guilty to capital murder and rape. A month later, he gave another statement to the police where he said that he, Eric, Derek, Richard, Geoff, John, and Joe went to Michelle's apartment. She opened the door and they pushed their way in. They raped her. Richard grabbed a knife and stabbed her first. Then Daniel stabbed her the third or fourth time. Eric never stabbed her. On February 18, 1999, a more sophisticated DNA test was conducted on all 7 men's DNA compared to the samples left at the crime scene. And guess what? None of them were a match. So what gives? Were any of these men actually involved? Who did this unknown DNA belong to? 4 days later, Detective Ford received a call from a woman named Karen. Karen told him that she had gotten a letter from her boyfriend, an inmate named Omar Ballard. If you remember way back at the beginning of this story, Omar Ballard was the man who Michelle and Billy had protected from the mob of angry neighbors who thought that he had beat up on some woman. Well, Karen had a story for Detective Ford. In the letter that she had received from Omar, who was now in prison, he provided a full confession to killing Michelle alone back in 1997. What in the world? I am sure Detective Ford's head was spinning, but knowing him, it didn't appear that he was after the truth anymore. He just wanted to put as many people behind bars, no matter the cost. Next time, I'll share with you all about Omar's confession. True Crime Army, I have put this case on the back burner for so long because it is so very upsetting and just complicated. But here we go. As I creep closer and closer to the 5th birthday of Military Murder Podcast, which is coming up in November, I am getting to some of the most high-profile murder cases connected to military personnel. I am so happy that you choose to have me in your ears every single week, so I just want to say thank you. Shout out to Haley and Myrtle for researching this episode for me, and to Myrtle for writing the script. My sources for this episode include a 7-part article from the Pilot Online, the Navy Times, and a documentary called The Confessions on PBS. Military Murder was created by Mama Margot Productions. The music was created by Ty-Ops. Until next time, remember, you never really know what someone is capable of, so remain vigilant always. You have a fabulous week, and I'll keep digging to bring you the conclusion of this military murder story next week.
Mama's working on her podcast. I don't want to.